The morning of Arthur Lane's 60th birthday was not marked with cake balloons or the sound of laughter. Instead, it began with the clang of a mailbox lid and the sharp breath he drew upon opening the last envelope he would receive at the house he once called home. Final notice of foreclosure, it read. Arthur stood on the worn-out porch of his suburban home in Denver, the same house he'd bought with his late wife Margaret 40 years earlier. The paint had peeled off the wooden beams, and the garden she'd once tended had turned to a thicket of weeds. She was gone 3 years now. Cancer had taken her in the same slow, cruel way it had taken the warmth from his eyes. The house had become a mausoleum of memories and unpaid bills. He sat down in the rickety chair, letting the wind flip the letter out of his hand. It didn't matter anymore. He had lost his job 2 years ago, a cost-cutting casualty from a company he had helped build. No pension, no savings. What little was left had gone into Margaret's treatments. Their daughter Emily had offered to take him in, but Arthur couldn't bring himself to be a burden. She had 2 kids, a full-time job, and a tiny apartment in Chicago. He couldn't breathe in cramped places anymore. And so as the sun dipped lower that day, Arthur made a decision. He packed everything that mattered, some clothes, Margaret's photo albums, a journal, and a faded U.S. Army backpack from his younger years, and left. No destination, no map. Just a thought, if I'm going to start over, it has to be somewhere no one knows me. Somewhere I can hear myself think again. The old pickup coughed to life like a stubborn smoker. Arthur hadn't driven it farther than the grocery store in years, but now it bore everything he owned, creaking beneath the weight of nostalgia and uncertainty. He drove west, not because he had a plan, only a direction, toward mountains, trees, and silence. Towards somewhere the world wouldn't expect anything of him anymore. By nightfall, Arthur had left Denver behind, trading city lights for starlight. He found a rest stop along a narrow mountain pass and parked beneath a canopy of pines. The air was cooler here, tinged with pine resin and moss. It smelled like peace. He lit a small fire, just like he used to on weekend camping trips with Margaret. The flames crackled, casting shadows that danced on the trunks of ancient trees. Arthur pulled out his journal and scribbled day 1. I am no longer a homeowner, no longer a company man, no longer anybody's boss. Just a man with a backpack and a rusted truck. But I'm still breathing. Maybe that's enough. He slept in the truck that night, curled in the back seat, Margaret's photograph pressed to his chest. The next day, a weathered sign caught his eye as he rolled slowly down a gravel road just past the edge of Grand Mesa National Forest. Cabin for sale. No electricity, no water. 5,000? OBO, he stopped. The sign leaned sideways like it had been there for years, yet something about it called to him. A faded arrow pointed into the woods. Curiosity or fate nudged him forward. He followed the winding trail, tires crunching against rocks, until the trees parted to reveal a clearing. And there it was, a small log cabin half swallowed by nature. The roof sagged, the chimney was cracked. Vines crept up the chimneys, but to Arthur it looked like freedom. The place was abandoned but solid. No graffiti, no rot, just forgotten. He knocked out a habit. No answer, of course. He stepped inside. Dust coated every surface. A cast-iron stove rusted in the corner, and a single wooden chair faced an empty fireplace. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. It was perfect. Back in town, he tracked down the name on the sign. A woman in her 70s answered the door, surprised anyone had noticed it. You want that old thing, she said with a laugh. My husband built it in the 60s. He passed 10 years ago. I haven't been up there since. Arthur handed her $4,000 in cash, almost everything he had left. She blinked. That's less than I was asking. He smiled. It's all I've got, but I'll take care of it. She nodded. Then it's yours. Back at the cabin, Arthur stood on the porch, his porch now, and looked out at the woods. It didn't feel like a downgrade. It felt like a beginning. That night, as he gathered fallen branches to make a fire, something inside him shifted. The air felt different. He no longer felt like a man running from something. He felt like a man building something new. For the first time in years, Arthur didn't feel like a ghost. The first weeks were hard. Arthur quickly discovered just how much he had taken for granted: running water, heat, light, even noise. Out here, silence was a full-time companion, the kind that stared you straight in the eye and dared you to flinch. He had brought bottled water and canned food enough to last a month. But what came after, he wasn't sure. Each morning he woke up to birdsong, not traffic, not cell phones, just nature's heartbeat. The first chore was always building a fire, then a cold wash from a nearby stream, then work clearing, brush chopping, wood, sealing up gaps in the cabin to keep the wind out. Arthur wasn't used to this kind of labor. His back ached, his hands blistered. He was 60 years old and his body reminded him constantly, but there was something deeply honest in the pain, something cleansing. He was earning his survival day by day, and every evening he'd sit by the fire with his journal and write. Day 9, I caught myself humming today. Didn't even realize it until I stopped. I think I might be okay. He began to notice the small things, how the wind whispered differently through pine needles versus oak leaves, how the sky turned lavender before the stars emerged, how animal tracks left stories in the mud, rabbits, foxes, once even a bear. Solitude was no longer a punishment. It was becoming a friend. But it wasn't all romantic. One morning he woke to find his food stash raided squirrels had chewed through the corner of his supply bin. He had to hang everything from the rafters after that. Another time, a sudden rainstorm soaked his firewood and left him shivering all night. He learned fast the wilderness didn't care about your plans. And yet, for every setback, something inside him grew stronger. Where fear once lived, now there was resilience. Where doubt once crept, a quiet confidence settled in. Day 17. I thought I'd be lonely. I'm not really. Sometimes I miss voices, but mostly I just miss her. The pain of Margaret's absence still lingered, but it had softened. Grief was no longer a constant roar. It had become a low river that ran quietly beneath his days. He talked to her sometimes, especially when he struggled. Sitting by the fire, her photo in his lap, he'd whisper, "What would you do, Mags?" And somehow the answers would come. He started to clean the inside of the cabin, slowly bringing it back to life. He built shelves, found an old rocking chair at a junk shop in town and fixed it up. Planted a tiny garden using wild seeds and compost. Each improvement was a brick in the foundation of his new life. By the end of the first month, Arthur had changed. He stood straighter, smiled more, slept better. He even laughed once, really laughed, when he slipped in the stream and landed flat on his back in the mud. He didn't recognize the man who had driven into the woods 30 days ago. That man had lost everything. This man was just beginning. It was late September when Arthur first saw another soul near his cabin. He was gathering firewood at the edge of his clearing when he heard it, a distant, deliberate crunch of boots on dry leaves. Not the soft shuffle of a deer or the scamper of squirrels. This was human. He stood still, listening. The footsteps came closer, cautious but steady. Then emerging from between two fir trees came a woman, maybe in her early 50s, tall, weathered, with long, gray-streaked hair pulled back under a canvas cap. She wore a heavy flannel and carried a walking stick. Her backpack looked worn, well-traveled. She froze when she saw Arthur. He raised one hand slowly. "Not many folks wander out this far," he said with a soft smile. The woman tilted her head. "Didn't think anyone lived in that old place anymore." "I do now," Arthur replied. She stepped closer, her expression still guarded but curious. "You military?" she asked, gesturing toward the pack at his feet, the faded USS. Army patch still visible. Once he nodded. "Vietnam, long time ago." She nodded. "My brother was in Desert Storm." There was a pause, and then she extended a hand. "Name's Claire." "Arthur," he said, shaking it firmly. Over the next hour, they sat by the fire and swapped pieces of their stories. Claire was a seasonal forest guide, spending half the year hiking mapping trails and collecting ecological data for the Parks Department. The other half, she drifted between campsites and cabins, living off the grid by choice. "You chose this life?" Arthur asked, surprised. Claire smiled. "I got tired of chasing things that didn't matter. Phones, deadlines, noise. Out here," well, she gestured to the forest. "Out here, you remember who you are." Arthur nodded slowly. He understood now. Claire stayed only for a few hours, but she returned the next week with a bag of coffee beans and a tin mug. "For when the nights get cold," she said, dropping them into his hands. Arthur chuckled. "You have no idea." They sat on the porch that night, sipping by feet as the moon rose through the trees. Claire shared stories of hidden valleys of wolves she'd seen howling under snowlight, of wildflowers that bloomed only once every 10 years. Arthur listened like a child at story time, absorbing every word. She left again before sunrise, and so began a rhythm. Claire would appear every so often, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to talk. Arthur found himself looking forward to her visits. She wasn't company in the way the world defined it. She didn't ask about his past. She didn't probe the wound of his grief. She simply existed beside him, like the wind or the trees present, but never invasive. In her presence, Arthur didn't feel old. He felt alive. One evening, they were repairing a broken fence post near the stream when Claire asked quietly, "Do you ever think about going back?" Arthur paused, hammer in hand. "To what?" She shrugged. "The world, cities, people, the life you had before." He thought for a long moment. "I used to think I'd go back when I had something to show for it, a plan, a purpose. But now," he looked up at the sky at the golden sliver of moon rising. "Now I think this is it. This is the life. No one to answer to, no one to disappoint, just me and the trees." Claire nodded, saying nothing, but he saw a softness in her eyes, a quiet understanding. Later that night, as he watched her silhouette disappear into the woods, Arthur felt something strange stir in his chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something like hope, something like possibility. And after 60 years of being defined by losses, that feeling alone was a kind of miracle. Autumn slipped away like breath on a mirror. By mid-November, the forest wore a coat of white, and Arthur found himself preparing for his first full winter in the cabin. The nights grew bitter, the wind more persistent. Even the birds seemed to vanish, leaving behind only the crunch of snow beneath his boots and the sharp caws of distant ravens. He had spent the last month chopping firewood, insulating the cabin with moss and clay, and storing dried beans, rice, and root vegetables in the root cellar he'd dug himself. Claire had brought extra wool blankets, a heavy-duty lantern, and a handmade quilt stitched in deep blues and reds. "It was my mother's," she said quietly as she handed it to him. "She'd want it used." Arthur didn't know what to say. He simply laid a hand over hers and nodded. The snow came heavy that year, thicker than the locals had predicted. Arthur woke one morning to find the front door snowed shut. He had to climb out the back window and shovel a tunnel just to get to his firewood. The days were short, the nights long, the cold unforgiving. But Arthur endured. He fell into a rhythm rise with the sun feed the fire hall, water from the frozen stream, cook a small meal, write in his journal, then read by firelight until sleep took him. Books became his companions. Old ones Claire had left, mostly Jack London Thoreau, Mary Oliver's poetry. He read The Old Man and the Sea 3 times in January alone. Day 89. Hemingway wrote that a man can be destroyed, but not defeated. I think I'm starting to understand what he meant. Still, winter brought its own trials. One night, Arthur slipped on a patch of ice while chopping wood and gashed his forearm. The blood froze almost instantly, but the pain lingered. He wrapped it tight with strips of cloth, gritting his teeth as he stitched it himself by the fire. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Another time, a pack of coyotes crept close to the cabin. Their howls echoed in the night, haunting and primal. Arthur stood at the window with his old hunting rifle in hand, though he never had to fire it. They came and went like ghosts. But the hardest part wasn't the pain or the danger. It was the silence. When the wind stopped, when the snow fell without sound, when the night stretched so long he forgot what day it was. Those were the moments that tested him most, moments when the weight of his solitude pressed hardest. And yet he never once considered leaving, because somewhere in the stillness he had begun to rebuild himself. Not as the man he used to be, but as someone entirely new. In early February, Claire returned. She arrived during a blizzard, snow clinging to her like feathers. Arthur opened the door, stunned. "Are you crazy?" She grinned. "Had to make sure you hadn't frozen into an icicle." He ushered her in, threw extra logs on the fire, and poured her a cup of pine needle tea. They didn't speak much that night. They didn't need to. They sat close to the flames, the wind howling outside like a choir of ghosts, and simply existed together. Later, as she wrapped herself in the quilt by the hearth, Arthur asked, "Why do you always come back?" Claire looked at him, then really looked. Because I know what it's like to be alone too long. He nodded slowly. I'm glad you do, he said. And for the first time in months, Arthur slept through the night without waking once. March came in with a sigh as if winter itself had grown weary. The snow melted in uneven patches, revealing damp earth and mossy stones. Small green shoots peeked bravely through the frost-bitten soil. The stream, long buried in ice, began to sing again. Arthur stood at the edge of the clearing one morning, a steaming tin mug in his hands, and listened to the world wake up. Life was returning, and so it seemed was he. Claire stayed through most of March. She helped him clear the fallen branches, patch the roof, and repair the trail that had collapsed under the snow's weight. She showed him how to build a compost pile and how to tap a nearby birch tree for sap. Together they planted early spring crops, turnips, carrots, and wild greens. Arthur knelt in the soil, pressing seeds into the earth with weathered hands. It felt symbolic, like he was planting pieces of himself into the ground, daring them to grow. One night as they sat by the fire sharing a tin of lentil stew, Claire told him about her childhood in Montana, how she had grown up the youngest of six, how her father had been a lumberjack with a bad temper, how her mother had once carved tiny wooden animals to keep the peace. I ran away when I was 17, she said quietly. Hitchhiked my way across 5 states, slept in tents, cabins, once even in a school bus someone left in a field. Arthur studied her profile. She didn't say it with bitterness, just honesty. And now he asked, she looked at him. Now I make my own peace. He understood. That night, as the fire dimmed, Claire kissed his cheek before crawling into her bedroll. It was nothing grand, nothing romantic, just a small gesture. But it bloomed in his chest like the first crocus of spring. In April, Claire left again, but this time she promised she'd be back. Arthur felt her absence keenly. The forest seemed quieter without her laugh echoing off the trees. But he had work to do. The garden required tending. The trail to town still needed clearing. And inside he began renovating the second room of the cabin, converting it into a modest study with shelves, a desk, and a small window that looked toward the east. He began writing longer entries in his journal, then short essays, then stories, fiction at first, but rooted in the soil of his own experience. Day 135. I used to think I had nothing left to give, but maybe the truth is I was just finally beginning to give something real. One day he walked the 3 miles into the tiny nearby town of Copper Ridge. Just a diner, a post office, and a general store. There he introduced himself to the owner, an old man named Walt, and offered to fix the back porch in exchange for supplies. Walt shrugged. A man willing to work without asking for money, I must be dreaming. Arthur laughed. I'm not doing it for money. I'm doing it so I don't lose my mind talking to squirrels. Walt chuckled. Fair enough. By the end of the week, Arthur had rebuilt the porch steps, fixed 2 broken windows, and patched a leak in the roof. Walt gave him a bag of rice, a jar of homemade jam, and 2 new flannel shirts. More than that, he gave Arthur a sense of usefulness again. That night, Arthur wrote something different in his journal. Not a log, not a reflection, but a letter to Margaret. Dear Mags, you wouldn't believe the life I've found out here. It's quiet but not empty. It's hard but not cruel. And I'm learning how to smile again, how to grow things, how to talk to people, even how to let someone in. I miss you every day, but I don't feel lost anymore. I think you'd be proud of me. Love always, Arthur. It happened in late May, just when the first shoots of spinach and beans had started showing signs of life. Arthur had been in town helping Walt again, repairing a fallen sign when the sky darkened like spilled ink. The rain came suddenly in sheets so thick it blurred the landscape. By the time Arthur drove back, branches littered the trail and water pooled in low hollows. When he reached the clearing, his heart clenched. The stream had swelled into a torrent, cutting a new path dangerously close to the cabin. The garden was under several inches of water, rows of seedlings floating like wreckage. One of the compost bins had overturned. His woodpile was soaked. And worst of all, smoke. The lightning must have struck a pine just behind the cabin. Though the fire was small and dying in the rain, one corner of the roof had caught. Blackened shingles curled like burnt leaves, and the scent of wet ash clung to the air. Arthur leapt into action. He tore off smoldering shingles with his bare hands, hauling water from the stream, in an old pot, dousing the roof until the last of the embers hissed and died. His arms burned, his knees gave out once on the ladder. But he didn't stop, not until the danger had passed. Then he collapsed on the muddy ground, soaked and shaking, heart pounding. He stared up at the sky, rain still falling, and laughed, a bitter, breathless laugh. Really, he whispered to the heavens, I build a new life, and you send a damn firestorm. Next day, Claire returned. She had seen the storm from miles away and rushed back, hiking through mud and downed trees. When she saw the cabin damaged, but standing, her expression softened. You're a stubborn old mule, you know that, she said, hugging him tightly. Guilty as charged, Arthur murmured into her shoulder. Together they began the recovery. She helped him salvage what was left of the garden, rebuild the corner of the roof, and reset the compost. Arthur repaired the scorched beams one nail at a time. It was slow work, but it grounded him. Each stroke of the hammer reminded him that survival wasn't just about outlasting the storms, it was about rebuilding after they passed. One night they sat together under a tarp stretched between trees, drinking black coffee and watching the stars blink back into the clearing. Claire spoke first. You ever think the world's trying to tell you something? Arthur looked at her. Every day. She chuckled. And what's it telling you now? He was quiet for a long moment. That I'm not done yet. She reached out and took his hand. Neither am I. They kissed for the first time that night, not out of desperation or even romance, but because something unspoken had finally been understood. They were not lost souls anymore. They were survivors, builders, partners. As the fire crackled between them, Arthur thought of Margaret, and for the first time since her death, he felt no guilt for the joy blooming inside him. Love wasn't a betrayal, it was a continuation, a tribute. Day 210. The storm came to destroy me. Instead, it reminded me what I'm made of. By summer, the cabin no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like home. The garden, though still recovering from the flood, had rebounded with surprising vigor. Beans climbed their poles with determined grace. Wildflowers bloomed along the edge of the clearing, attracting bees and hummingbirds. The cabin, once a crumbling shell, now stood proud, its patched roof, repainted shutters, and a handmade porch swing, testaments to what could be restored when someone chose to care. Arthur had changed too. He rose each morning, not out of duty, but with quiet excitement. He had a rhythm, a purpose. Mornings were spent tending the garden or splitting logs. Afternoons saw him writing his journals, now a growing pile of essays and stories, ideas blooming like saplings in spring. He wrote about grief and grit, about loneliness and love, about what it meant to be human when no one was watching. Claire came and went, but now she stayed longer, sometimes for weeks. They had carved out a life together, not bound by convention, but by intention. One day she brought a surprise, a solar generator. It's small, she said, hoisting it out of her pack, but enough to charge a lamp, maybe run a fan. Arthur blinked. You're spoiling me. You're 61, she grinned. Consider it a birthday gift. He laughed, then paused. I didn't even realize it was my birthday. Claire's eyes softened. That's because you stopped counting the years you survived and started living them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he kissed her. With the solar unit in place, Arthur dusted off his old laptop, something he hadn't touched in over a year. It still worked. Slowly, he began typing up his journals, editing the pieces he liked most. One afternoon, Claire peered over his shoulder. You should send these to someone, Arthur scoffed. Who'd want to read an old man's ramblings? She tapped the screen. This isn't rambling. This is wisdom. It's truth. People need that. He stared at her, unsure. But that night, he printed out 3 essays and mailed them from the tiny post office in Copper Ridge to a literary journal that accepted unsolicited submissions. He didn't expect anything. He just wanted to try. Weeks passed, life continued. He fished in the creek, hosted a couple of hikers who got turned around in the woods, began working part-time, helping Walt run the general store, stocking shelves, sweeping floors, even recommending books. I thought you were a hermit, Walt joked once. I was, Arthur said. Now I'm just here. Then one day a letter arrived, typed, formal, from the editor of Northridge Review. Arthur opened it slowly. They wanted to publish one of his pieces. He sat on the porch swing, stunned. For a full minute, he just stared at the paper. Then he stood up, walked to the garden and shouted, "Margaret, you won't believe this bird scattered." A deer lifted its head, and Arthur laughed freely, fully, without sorrow. That night, Claire returned from a week-long hike and found him dancing barefoot in the clearing. She dropped her pack and grinned. "Okay, now I'm curious." He held up the letter like a trophy. She read it, smiled. "See, I told you." They celebrated with stew wine from a bottle Claire had stashed for a special moment, and laughter that echoed through the trees like music. Later, as they lay side by side under a blanket of stars, Arthur whispered, "I lost everything at 60. Claire turned toward him. And now he smiled into the darkness. "Now I have more than I ever dreamed." Autumn returned again, softer this time, like an old friend rather than a test. Golden leaves danced down from the trees, covering the cabin in a blanket of fire and gold. The stream, once swollen with spring rains, now babbled gently in its narrow bed. The sky stretched wider and the nights turned crisp. Arthur stood on the porch one morning sipping warm cider, watching a fox dart through the underbrush. He was 61 now, fitter, stronger, his beard whiter but fuller, his eyes clear. There were lines on his face that hadn't been there a year ago, but they weren't from stress. They were carved by sun, wind, and effort, by living. Inside, Claire stirred pancake batter. She hummed soft, off-key content. The smell of cinnamon drifted through the doorway. They had grown into each other. Not as a replacement for what had been lost, but as an addition, as something new and entirely their own. Arthur's published essay had sparked a quiet ripple. More requests came, other small journals, blogs, even a podcast that asked if he'd be willing to speak about reinvention after 60. He politely declined the interview, but he sent them a story instead. It was titled Cabin Lessons, and it ended with this line, "Some things fall apart not to end us, but to make space for the life we never dared imagine." In November, a young man named Peter knocked on Arthur's door. He was 27, thin as a sapling, with anxious eyes and a guitar strapped to his back. "I read your story," he said. I just needed to see if it was real." Arthur chuckled. "The cabin's real. The peace is real. The pain. That was real too. Why are you here?" Peter's story came out in pieces: burnout, heartbreak, a job he hated, a life that felt like someone else's. He had read Arthur's essay on a blog at 2 a.m. while lying on the floor of his studio apartment, unable to sleep. "I thought if you could start over at 60, Peter said, "maybe I could at 27. Arthur didn't say anything right away. He just opened the door wider. "You hungry?" Peter nodded. And just like that, the cabin grew again. Peter stayed for a week, helped stack wood, learned to plant garlic, wrote songs in the evenings, and played them by the fire. Arthur listened, tapping his boot to the rhythm, Claire nodding along. When Peter left, he hugged Arthur tightly. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed." Arthur watched him walk into the woods with a backpack full of hope, and he smiled. That winter, Arthur and Claire put up holiday lights made of pine cones and dried orange slices. They invited Walt over for dinner. They sang old songs out of tune and laughed until they cried. Arthur didn't miss the old life anymore. Not the office, not the money, not the man he had been. That man had died with Margaret. But this man, the one who chopped his own wood, who made stew from scratch, who wrote by candlelight and danced in clearings, this man had begun at 60, and he wasn't done yet. Snow returned once more, falling softly over the pines like a quiet blessing. Arthur turned 62 in January. He didn't mark the date with cake or candles, just a quiet morning, by the fire, a pen in hand, and a sense of calm that went deeper than words. Outside, the forest was silent. Inside, his life was full. The cabin had become more than shelter. It was a living thing. Every repaired beam, every shelf he'd built, every plant in the window had been shaped by his hands. The garden now slept under snow, but he knew it would bloom again come spring. He would too. One afternoon, Arthur received another letter. This one came not from a journal, but from a publishing house. A small press in Oregon had come across his essays and wanted to compile them into a book, something honest and simple. A memoir. He stared at the letter for a long time, running his fingers over the words. Then he looked at Claire, who was pouring tea beside the fire. She smiled before he even spoke. "Told you," he laughed. "It's not a bestseller. Does it need to be?" He shook his head. No, I just never thought I'd leave anything behind worth printing. Claire took his hand. You left a trail, Arthur. Others will find it, and they'll know it's okay to start over. The book was titled Still Standing, A Life After 60. It was released quietly without fanfare, but it found its readers people in quiet corners of the world, from veterans in small towns to single mothers in cities, from young creatives to older dreamers who'd nearly given up. Letters began to arrive, dozens, then hundreds. Arthur read them all. They didn't praise his writing style or his grammar. They thanked him for his truth, for showing them that broken things could be rebuilt not into what they once were, but into something better. He replied to each one by hand. Years passed. Arthur and Claire aged with grace. The lines on their faces deepened, but so did the light in their eyes. They traveled sometimes short trips to nearby towns, lakes, and once to the coast, but they always returned to the cabin, to their home. Peter visited often. Sometimes he brought his girlfriend, sometimes his dog. He had started a nonprofit to help young adults recover from burnout using nature and music. He called it the Fox Trail Project. He told people it all started with a man in a cabin. Arthur always laughed at that. One warm summer evening, Arthur sat in his rocking chair, watching the sunset bleed gold and crimson across the sky. The forest hummed around him, bees whispered in the garden. Claire was humming in the kitchen, a pie baked in the wood stove. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathed deep, and smiled, because he had done something most people only dreamed of. He had lost everything and found himself. He had started over and built something true. He had lived not in the shadow of who he was, but in the light of who he had become. Final entry, day 1862. The cabin is quiet tonight. I've just finished reading a letter from a woman in Maine. She said my story gave her the courage to walk away from a life that no longer fit. She planted tomatoes last spring. Her first crop failed, but she's trying again. That's all life really is, isn't it? Planting things, hoping they grow, starting again when they don't. I used to think the end of my career, my house, even Margaret, meant the end of my story. But it wasn't. It was the beginning. I was 60 when I walked into these woods. Now I am more alive than I have ever been. And this life, this quiet, sacred, beautiful life, was worth every broken thing it took to get here. Arthur Lane.